All right, it is noon Eastern, so I'm going to kick things off. Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer Doliak, a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center and economics professor at Texas A&M University. Welcome to the fourth webinar in our five-part series on how to reduce violent crime. Each hour-long webinar consists of 5 short presentations of research by leading scholars in this space, with an emphasis on policy takeaways. We know that many are concerned about rising rates of shootings and homicides in many US cities and hope that this research provides useful guidance for communities that are wondering what they can do to improve public safety and save lives. If you missed any of the first 3 webinars, you can find the recordings on the Niskanen Center website. We will start things off today with Amanda Egan. Amanda, you have 10 minutes and the Zoom floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. Let me start my screen share. All right, you're seeing everything okay? Oh wait, you're not, okay. All right, so thanks Jen for having me here to present our research on misdemeanor prosecution. So this is a joint project with Jen Doliak from Texas A&M, who you know, and Anna Harvey from New York University. So recently, reform-minded DAs across the country have begun to not prosecute certain low-level nonviolent misdemeanors, from George Gascon in Los Angeles, Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, Rachel Rollins in Suffolk County, where Boston is located, Marilyn Mosby in Baltimore, and many more. These new wave of progressive prosecutors have been implementing all kinds of policies to reduce the prosecution of drug crimes, of quality of life crimes, prostitution, and other types of low-level, mostly nonviolent misdemeanors. Now, as you can imagine, they have also been facing backlash. Law enforcement, some members of the community, and some pundits have been wary of the potential safety implications of this increasing leniency in prosecuting crimes. Some have even begun to blame the recent uptick in violence and homicide, in particular, on these lenient prosecution policies for nonviolent crimes. And so it is within this context that we are asking the question, what is the impact of not prosecuting nonviolent misdemeanor offenses on subsequent criminal legal contact for the defendants who are the beneficiaries of this leniency? And in particular, for the purposes of today's talk, I will also talk and focus on what about the impact of not prosecuting nonviolent misdemeanors on future arrests and charges for violent crimes in particular. So why is this even a question, right? We might think that there are 2 potential consequences of not prosecuting an individual defendant, right? And so we think that prosecution itself could potentially have a deterrent effect, right? In the sense that if this individual defendant is prosecuted, goes through the process, goes through the criminal legal process, even if their charges are dismissed, they're getting an idea of the probability of being caught, of the consequences of being caught, and that this increased punishment could reduce the probability that they go on to commit future crimes or get involved in the criminal legal process in the future. We also know, however, that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of collateral consequences to even being charged with a crime, right? Charges, even that lead to a non-conviction or dismissal, can end up on criminal background checks that employers can see, that landlords can see, and this mark of a criminal record can follow people around for years. These marks may lead to fewer opportunities for these individuals in many spheres, and these fewer opportunities could actually lead to more future criminal behavior or more future criminal legal contact. And so we want to ask, what is the average impact of not prosecuting these defendants on their future criminal legal contact? In order to answer this question, we gathered data on nearly 68,000 nonviolent misdemeanor cases in Suffolk County, Massachusetts, where Boston is located. We have cases for nearly 20 years. And the data that we have on these cases includes information on the prosecutor who made the decision about whether to actually prosecute the case or not. And so once the defendant is arrested, an assistant district attorney in that office is going to make a decision about whether the prosecutor's office should move forward with prosecution, even if that case may eventually be dismissed or potentially convicted. We're going to be focusing on that very first decision about whether to move forward with prosecution on this case or not. And in Suffolk County, again, where we have our data, nearly 21% of the nonviolent misdemeanor cases that we focus on are not prosecuted. That is, the ADA assigned to make a decision on that case chose to not prosecute it immediately, basically declined to prosecute it. The case did not move forward. So one thing we can do is simply compare the average recidivism rates of defendants who are not prosecuted to defendants who are prosecuted to try to get an initial idea of what the potential consequences of non-prosecution are. When we do this, we see that on average, defendants whose cases are not prosecuted are less likely to recidivate. That is, there appear to be, on average, public safety benefits from declining to prosecute these nonviolent misdemeanor cases. However, the cases that are not prosecuted are quite different from the cases that are prosecuted. Prosecuted cases are more likely to have defendants that have recent criminal legal contact. Those cases have more counts and more serious counts involved in them, and those cases are less likely to be victimless crimes. And so simply comparing the average recidivism rates of the prosecuted and not prosecuted defendants is not necessarily going to answer the causal question of what is the impact of not prosecuting an individual defendant on their future recidivism. Those differences we saw in recidivism rates on the previous slide could be due to selection, could be due to the fact that the non-prosecuted cases are just different than the prosecuted ones. So how are we going to tackle this question? It happens to be that in Suffolk County, the prosecutor who makes the decision that initial decision about whether to charge your case or not is basically assigned to a defendant's case randomly. Now, it's not literally a bingo ball as I've depicted here in this graphic, but the policies of the office make it so that the individual ADA assigned to that case is completely independent of the characteristics of the case or the defendant. And so by chance, a defendant may get a prosecutor who is particularly lenient, one who happens to not prosecute on average, say 30, 40, or 50% of the nonviolent misdemeanor cases that that individual prosecutor faces. However, by chance, the defendant may also be assigned to a harsher ADA, one who doesn't prosecute, say, 5% or 10% of the cases, that the nonviolent misdemeanor cases that they see. And it is this randomness in who ends up with a more lenient or less lenient prosecutor that we are going to use to try to understand what is the causal impact of non-prosecution on future criminal legal contact, and in particular, future criminal legal contact for violent crimes. Now, in support of the idea that these cases are basically randomly assigned to different types of ADAs who make that initial prosecution decision, we can see that cases assigned to very lenient ADAs look identical on average to cases assigned to harsher ADAs. This makes us more confident that these policies are ending up in a basically random assignment of cases to different types of ADAs. And so what do we find? We find that for those cases, for those defendants for whom being assigned a more lenient ADA versus a harsher ADA could potentially change the outcome of the charging decision, those marginal cases, not prosecuting those marginal nonviolent misdemeanors significantly reduces the probability of a new arrest for that defendant within 2 years by nearly 58%, and reduces the number of new arrests for that defendant within 2 years by 69%. And these outcomes are particularly true for first-time defendants that we see in our sample. That is, that when the person is showing up for the first time, that leniency is really mattering in terms of reducing their future criminal legal contact. And again, this is a seminar or webinar that is focused on violent crime. And we can look at the reductions in future recidivism by crime type. And we see that for these marginal nonviolent misdemeanor cases that are not prosecuted, We are also significantly reducing the probability of subsequent violent arrests within 2 years by 64%, large reductions even in future violent crime for those individual recipients or those individual beneficiaries of increased leniency on their nonviolent misdemeanor crimes. Now, one potential concern individuals might have is that a broader policy of non-prosecution, like we talked about on the earlier news articles for the various progressive prosecutor policies, could, while potentially reducing recidivism for the individual beneficiaries, for the individual defendants, could increase crime overall. And so we did take a look at this, and so far we see no evidence of large increases in reported crime after these broader non-prosecution policies go into effect. We looked at both Rachel Rollins' inauguration in Suffolk County, Massachusetts in early 2019. And we don't say she implemented a policy of non-prosecution for a list of about 15 nonviolent misdemeanor crimes. And we don't see any evidence of large increases in reported crime across several crime categories in Boston after she's inaugurated. And the implementation of other non-prosecution policies across the country, we similarly see no large increases in reported crime after those policies go into effect. And so overall, we see that scaling back prosecution for nonviolent misdemeanors could have large social benefits. We think there are many potential mechanisms for this. And in particular, at least in Massachusetts, not being charged with a crime significantly reduces the probability that a mark of that criminal record is going to follow this individual defendant around. But of course, it also reduces the time that the individual defendant spends tied up in the criminal legal system and avoids a record of conviction, as about 25% of prosecuted defendants in Suffolk County will end up with a conviction for that nonviolent misdemeanor crime. So these forces combine to reduce future recidivism, even for violent crimes, particularly for first-time defendants. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Amanda. And next up is Erin Shelton. Erin, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Jen. So very excited to be a part of the speaker series, and today I'm going to talk about street lighting. And so in particular, I'm going to report the results of the first and what I think is still the only ever randomized experiment that studies the effect of street lighting on public safety. It's work that's joint with Ben Hansen at the University of Oregon and Jason Lerner and Lucy Parker at the University of Chicago Crime Lab. I also want to acknowledge generous support for the project from Arnold Ventures, as well as our partners in New York City government. So in general, there's three main ways that we can control crime, right? We can invest in police and prisons, and this is probably, at least to some extent, a necessary part of crime control. It's also an approach that tends to be pretty expensive. It's expensive fiscally. It's also expensive socially. We can also invest in social programs, and there's certainly many good social programs, but social programs are notoriously difficult to scale. It's usually hard to replicate that elusive special sauce, right? Like a charismatic leader or a programmatic model that's highly tailored to local needs. So what else can we do? Well, I want to argue that there's potentially at least a third way, and that is focusing on changing the physical and the built environment. And so maybe at first blush, this might not seem like a very exciting idea, particularly if you think of criminal offenders as a highly motivated bunch of people, right? Because why would seemingly small changes to the built environment, like something like street lighting, deter an offender who's truly committed, right, to committing a crime? But actually, there's a lot of evidence that offenders aren't always so motivated or thoughtful, and that many crimes are simply crimes of opportunity. And we know that offenders tend to be thinking of the next 10 minutes of their lives rather than the next 10 years, right? And so it might be the case that interventions that affect the here and now can have an outsized impact. And there's one other feature of the built environment that I think creates some optimism, and that's the fact that it's something that we know how to scale, right? If it works, then there isn't as much of a concern about what the special sauce is. And that's going to be something that I think is quite important in this space. Okay, so let's talk about street lighting. This is not a new idea. In fact, it was Ben Franklin, who's often credited with designing the first candlelight street light in the United States for Philadelphia in 1757. But the idea behind street lighting is even older than that. In fact, reasonably sophisticated systems of street lighting using oil lamps have been documented in antiquity as far back as the 4th century BC in the Greek city-state of Antioch. And so probably it's right that this is an idea that is as old as civilization itself. Now, we've had lighting in the field for not 10 years, not 100 years, but probably thousands and thousands of years. And yet to date, until this project came along, there haven't been any randomized experiments. Typically the stuff that predates this, you have some kind of quasi-experiment where one community gets some lighting and then there's some comparison community selected by researchers that didn't receive the lighting. And if you think about the process that, say, the FDA uses to approve a new medical treatment, it's probably hard to imagine the FDA saying, well, we have a quasi-experiment and we have 2 people, one of whom got the treatment and one of whom didn't. So let's go ahead and approve some treatment on that basis. And so under the premise that social science research should aspire, when possible, to be no less rigorous than medical research, my colleagues and I wanted to see if we could design a field experiment to test the efficacy of lighting. Okay, so let me tell you about the intervention because the devil is always in the details, and that's probably especially true here. So this is an intervention that was rolled out in 2016, which incredibly is 5 years ago now, in the spring and the summer of 2016. And the setting for the experiment is public housing in New York City, where crime, despite some long declines in crime in New York City, public housing is a place where crime has been pretty sticky over the years. So for those of you who aren't terribly familiar with New York, or at least not the neighborhoods that have public housing, here's a sense for what these communities look like. Most of these communities are clusters of buildings that are inset from the street. They're arranged around green space. There's pathways through the community, and there's no commercial activity. There's no stores here. So that's an important feature of the environment. Overall, these communities don't look a whole lot different than a cluster of dorms on a college campus. So here's what a typical community looks like at ground level. You can see there's some benches. People are sitting on those benches by the entrance to a building. If you look closely, you can see that there's a couple of very dim yellow streetlights there. And they do provide a little bit of lighting at night, but they don't provide a lot of lighting. In particular, if you're a few yards away, these aren't going to be doing very much to light up the area. And so here's the type of lighting that the city moved in that we were able to study. So these are not normal streetlights that you're used to seeing. These are temporary lighting towers, the sort that you might see on a construction site at night. They're very, very bright. They're diesel powered. They make a little bit of noise. They turn on automatically at night. And so above all, these towers are just incredibly noticeable. They're located all around these communities. You really can't miss them. And so this intervention is about improving lighting, but it's also about making those lighting improvements as salient as possible. And so some of the effects we're seeing could be due not just to the effect of ambient lighting itself, but also to what we might term a demonstration effect, that you're making these communities seem as though they're cared for. And so overall, what I think we would say is this is a tactical lighting intervention. It's not a permanent infrastructure upgrade. So in spring of 2016, the city rolled hundreds of these lighting towers into 40 public housing communities. The lighting towers didn't cover the entire community. They were placed in areas where the police department felt as though they would best promote public safety. This is an actual map of one of these communities where the light towers ended up being placed. And you can see the coverage is good, but not complete. Okay, so our analysis is going to focus mainly on so-called index crimes. So these are among the most serious crimes that we have. They're the best measured crimes. They drive the lion's share of the social cost of crime. You might be wondering, well, how do we deal with the fact that there might be spillovers here, right? That maybe these lighting towers just push crime around the corner. How can we study this? So here's what we do. We estimate the effects for the public housing campuses. That's the blue area on the slide. But we also estimate treatment effects for the campus plus a 2-block radius around the campus. So that's that red box that you see in that slide. And so these net treatment effects that include the campus plus this 2-block catchment area, we view those as giving us a very conservative estimate of the treatment effect because only the blue area is being treated, but we're going to look for evidence of crime reductions or crime changes in the red areas. Okay, so what do we find? Well, we find evidence of some pretty large reductions in crime in these communities, around a 60% overall reduction in outdoor nighttime index crimes, but we're going to want to be conservative here and fold in those potential spillovers to that catchment area around the campus. And when we do that, we come up with an estimate that's around 36%. So we see that when you roll these light towers in, you get about a 36% reduction in outdoor nighttime index crimes. Now, a couple of other findings are worth noting. One is that we don't see the same kinds of impacts on lower level quality of life crimes. We're seeing the effects seem to concentrate in more serious offending. And second, and this is a really important point, we don't see any evidence that the lighting intervention increases arrests. So if anything, we actually see that arrests are declining by roughly the same amount as the major crimes. And this is important because a lot of observers have worried, well, you know, you roll some lights in and maybe this is just going to increase police surveillance. It's going to end up widening the net of the criminal justice system, subject people to misdemeanor prosecution, which we just heard can be a not so good thing. And so we don't see anything like that happening. We see crime going down. We don't see arrests going up. So what do we make of the experiment? I want to make a few points to make sure I'm not overselling the findings. It's just one RCT. We should have more. So first, it's important to note that in these residential communities, outdoor nighttime crime is only a small slice of the overall serious crime problem. A lot of the serious crimes in these communities happen indoors, things like domestic violence. And so overall, 15% of crime in these communities happens outdoors and at night. So when we talk about a 36% reduction in outdoor nighttime crimes off of a base of 15%, we're thinking overall about a 5 or 6% reduction in crime in these communities. So, you know, as always, right, not a panacea. These are important effects, but there's still crime in these communities after the lighting intervention was rolled out. Second, these are short-term impacts. We still don't know what the longer-term impacts are. And that's something that policymakers should definitely take heed of. And then finally, we need to think carefully about external validity here. So it's not clear that permanent lighting upgrades are going to have the same effect, right? They might not be as salient as these temporary light towers that you know, have this very, very obvious footprint. So, you know, we don't know what the effects would be of a permanent infrastructure upgrade. So I think overall, to sort of sum this up, I think I'd say a few things. So first, this is sort of a proof of concept paper that says, you know, tactical interventions using street lighting can be a way to control crime, especially over the summer in some high crime places, hotspots within a city. By providing light and signaling that a high crime neighborhood is being watched and cared for, this is an intervention that potentially empowers residents to reclaim the use of public space from those who might be up to no good. It's an intervention that might feel fairly scalable, both cost-wise and with respect to technical know-how. And I think that you know, creates some optimism around an intervention like this. So thank you so much. I'm very pleased that this project is a part of this wonderful series.
Great, thank you, Erin. Next up is Isaac Swenson. Isaac, you can take it away.
There we go. Okay, thanks, Jen. I will say that my internet connection went out during Amanda's talk, so fingers crossed for smooth sailing from here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my previous work. looking at substance abuse treatment, broadly considered on crime. And this was joint work with Sam Bondurant and Jason Lindo. So we're here to talk about violence, but the quickest and easiest way to motivate this issue is to show you a graph that I think we're all familiar with that looks at drug overdose deaths. So we know there's been an ongoing opioid epidemic. In the last 20 years, there's been a 350% increase in the drug overdose death rate. Nearly 841,000 people have died since 1999 in this epidemic. And provisional data from 2020 suggests that it's ongoing, that overdoses in 2020 leapt nearly 30%, highest ever recorded. And this is, the causes of this are varied: prescribing behaviors, availability of new drugs, aggressive pharmaceutical marketing, concerns about chronic pain, doctor shopping, all sorts of things underlying this. And drug overdose deaths are certainly not the only drug-related harm because of the opioid epidemic. There's a clear link between drugs and violence. And in the context of this paper, there's a clear need for treatment. So in the United States, over 20 million in the US have a substance use disorder. Not many of these people receive treatment. 80% of those abusing an illicit substance didn't receive treatment. 70% of arrestees have never been in any form of drug or alcohol treatment. And drugs are an underlying factor in a lot of criminal incidents. I think the total cost of drug-related crimes estimated at over $60 billion. And this isn't just crimes related to possession and sale. This is violent crimes. And so some of the mechanisms we like to think of when we link drugs and crime include psychopharmacological effects. There's the consumption of drugs directly leads to aggressive or elevated behavior that could be prone to violence. You can also think of economically compulsive effects, where addicts are seeking out funds to buy drugs, and the crimes they commit can have violence involved in them. There's also systemic effects with these underground drug markets and the dangerous supply chains. There's situations where there's violence among and against those associated with the drug trade. So as a society, we have to think about how to best reduce drug-related harm, such as this crime and violence that is a result of it. And as economists, we immediately go to our supply and demand graphs and figure out what are the different implications for either demand or supply side policies. So I'm not going to dive into these supply side policies much, other than to say there's a large literature. And I think if we summed it up broadly, we could say that where effects are found for supply side policies, they're often temporary. So we're thinking of law enforcement, market regulations, other supply side interventions, precursor regulatory environments, interdiction. That's not to say that there isn't encouraging evidence that supply side efforts could work, but I think broadly we've spent a lot of money on the war on drugs, and supply side policies are often mixed in terms of their results. More to the focus of this paper that I'm going to tell you about is demand side policies. So these are policies that can reduce drugs, reduce the quantity of drugs consumed, and thus the drug-related harms through prevention or treatment or information campaigns. And it's focusing specifically on treatment. There's a large literature that suggests treatment can be very effective. Most of this comes in the form of clinical trials evidence in the medical literature. So this is usually small studies focusing on particular modalities, often focusing on drug abuse because less frequent serious outcomes such as crime are often beyond the scope of these studies. But these studies suggest that all major modalities of treatment are effective in at least reducing drug abuse. In terms of larger scale, kind of broad considerations of substance abuse treatment, there's some evidence using observational data that reflects kind of the effects of substance abuse treatment across the United States. I have some work that shows expanding access to treatment through increasing the number of treatment facilities significantly reduces drug-induced mortality. There's a recent working paper that really pins down the timing of openings and closings of treatment facilities and shows there's a strong link between ER visits and these openings and closings. So getting onto this paper that I'm going to talk specifically about. Our goal is to quantify the effects of treatment expansions on community crime. And we're going to do this by looking at the openings and closings of these county substance abuse treatment facilities across the US. And I think it's important to note that these treatment facilities are the primary method whereby substance abuse treatment is delivered in the United States. So you can think of it as a very useful policy lever of sorts when we're thinking about these treatment facilities. So we will go into a lot of the detail on the data, but we have data on these treatment facilities, drug-related deaths. We have and crime data from the FBI. I won't go into the technical details on how we operationalize this, but I think you're all aware that economists obsess about credible, valid causal estimates. And this setting is a little different than what Erin just talked about. It's not a randomized controlled trials. It's a look at a whole bunch of different treatment facilities opening and closing, and we don't know why. Often each facility is opening, so it's a little more effort, I think, to convince people that this is credible, this is valid, this is causal. And so just to highlight a few of the things that we do to kind of reinforce the validity of the estimates, we expose it to all sorts of robustness checks. We pin down the timing of the openings and closings of these facilities to make sure it all lines up with the outcomes in the way that we think would make sense. We look for the greatest effects in the areas where we think that are closely linked to drug abuse. And we show that when you expand these facilities, it actually does increase admissions, which makes sense if it's going to subsequently affect drug-related harms or drug-related crime outcomes. All right, so I'm going to jump to some estimates here and just show you our main findings. So we first looked at homicide using several different data sets. First data set, I'll just focus here on column 5, is using county level mortality files. The second data set looking at homicide is from the FBI, and it's more of a municipal level data set. So when a county experiences an increase in the number of substance abuse treatment facilities, this estimate tells us that intentional homicide mortality rates are reduced by approximately 0.25%. And I'll unpack that for you in a moment. And at the municipal level, that estimate is 0.16%. And so to quickly kind of run through the effects on some of these other crimes, with homicides, not much for sexual assaults, a little decrease, some evidence for a decrease in aggravated assaults, not much for simple assaults, reductions in robbery, motor vehicle theft, burglary, and not much for larceny. So kind of to recap our main findings, we show that these treatments, expansions in treatments reduce the most costly of crimes, which are homicides, and also some other crimes as well. So the next thing we do in the papers, we spend a lot of time trying to kind of unpack what this means. This is a very broad look at substance abuse treatment in the United States. And we rely on previous literature that has tried to estimate the total social costs of crime for the different types of crime incidents. And we use that data to back out or run a back of the envelope calculation for our results and conclude that an additional substance abuse treatment facility in a county reduces county crime costs by approximately $2.9 million. So to add to that, if we take into consideration the reduction in drug-related mortality associated with expanding treatment facilities, that number jumps up to $7.65 million. So the reduction in terms of drug-related mortality and criminal activity around $7.65 million. And this is, of course, probably just a small glimpse at the total benefits to society of having substance abuse treatment available for citizens. But even just with these outcomes considered, it's clear when you compare it to the average annual cost of substance abuse treatment facility, operating costs of these facilities at $1.1 million, that this seems like a very worthwhile investment. So just to conclude, our results show that there are broad-based benefits to expanding substance abuse treatment in terms of public safety. And this stands in contrast to maybe some of the not in my backyard arguments that you've heard that are used to hinder attempts to expand access to treatment. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Isaac. Sarah Commissaro, you are up next.
You can't see them?
We cannot see your slides. We see your screen.
Okay, let's see if I can double click. I actually
There we go.
want to open it. Can you see that?
Yes.
And can you see if it advances?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you so much to Jen Doliak for having me, to the Niskanen Center for hosting this summer series. I'm Sarah Camacho. I'm an assistant professor at the Sanford School at Duke University. And today I'll be talking about some of my joint work with my colleague, Robert Gonzalez, who has recently moved to Georgia Tech. And this is mostly based on our paper that appeared in the Journal of Public Economics in 2020 about community monitoring and crime, evidence from Chicago's Safe Passage program, but I'll try to highlight a few other things that we've done to expand upon this as I speak. Okay, so this paper, we're studying a community monitoring intervention at scale and its effects on crime. This was a program that was carried out in a public school setting. So in the Chicago Public Schools, it's called the Safe Passage program. This is a community monitoring program that I'll describe in more detail in a moment, but we think of this as an unbundling of traditional policing tasks. And so what we mean by this is there's sort of a splitting off, if you will, of basic crime surveillance and reporting tasks that are handed off or sort of peeled off of the roles of a traditional police officer and handed to civilians in this particular setting. So the Safe Passage program, just in a nutshell, it established what are called safe passage routes around designated Chicago public elementary and high schools, and also middle schools. There aren't that many middle schools in CPS, but in any case, this is not all schools in Chicago, but specific schools were selected for this program. It started in the 2009-10 school year and continues to present, although I'll note that our study here ends with the 2017-18 school year. And so just to give you a little who, where, and when, the things I want to emphasize about this community monitoring program is that these are unarmed, paid civilians, and I should also add in there that these are adults who are employed by local nonprofit organizations. They're not employees of the Chicago Police Department nor of Chicago Public Schools, but they work for a local neighborhood organization that is contracting with Chicago Public Schools to provide these services. These community monitors stand watch on designated city blocks around CPS schools during school arrival and dismissal time. So that'll be sort of important for what I talk about on regular attendance days during the school year. So they're not there during the school day. They're only there when students are arriving and leaving. And then they're not there like on teacher professional development days, nor on the weekends, nor during the summer. If you look at the left-hand side of my slides, this is just a quick example of Kenwood High School in Chicago. And so you can see the school's location. It's the little blue sort of building icon and the route for safe passage monitors. So what I want to emphasize, these routes are selected based on sort of students' travel patterns, but they're not like square. They don't necessarily surround the school. And so they're selected with some intentionality with knowledge of the local community. Okay, so this program, it had two explicit stated goals. So one was to reduce the likelihood that CPS students would become victims of violent incidents. I think implicit in this goal is also the goal to reduce the likelihood that students are exposed to or witness violent incidents. And then secondly, this is a public education context. So the bigger goal of this program was to create a safe, secure, and supportive school environment to increase student attendance and improve academic performance. Robert and I have some related work forthcoming at Education, Finance, and Policy, where we show that this program actually decreases absences over after a number of years of implementation. So it's so here on the left-hand side, I'll just sort of Kenwood is one of the small segments here, but this is a little bit of what the program looked like in Chicago. I believe this is the 2014-15 school year. The program was sort of scaling up and expanding over time. And then on the right here, photo credit to the New York Times. The monitors have a visible presence on these routes. They wear bright neon vests and they're there every school day. And so it's known that this is sort of part of the students' arrival and dismissal, and they're part of sort of the school setting. So what we do in this paper, we combine two different sources of data. The first is something we put together by combining lots of information from Chicago Public Schools to put together and document the block level expansion of this program over time. And so we're using all sorts of different sources to sort of carefully document this. I'll show you some maps on the next page. And then we're pairing this documentation at the block level with crime data from the city of Chicago. It's perhaps known to people in this audience, but these are block level crimes. We're restricting to the school years between 2007-8 and 2017 and 18, and we're looking at. We have this data that's available through the City of Chicago data portal that gives us information at the block level on different types of crimes, where they happened, and an indicator for whether they result in an arrest. So we're pairing this with what we've done to put together documentation of which blocks were covered by safe passage and when. So here's just an example showing you sort of the scale up over time. The program was pretty small, 40-something high schools in its initial year in 2009-10, and then by 2017-18, covering a number of elementary, middle, and high schools. Sort of enfolded in this were mass closings of public elementary schools in Chicago, and so the program did have some ties into that policy, which I think we tried to deal with reasonably in the paper. So what do? So we take this documentation of block level coverage of the Safe Passage program and use it to sort of classify all blocks in Chicago into 5 or so different groups. So for each school year, we're interested in whether that city block was covered by Safe Passage. These are in blue in this sort of like zoom in that I'm showing you on the left here, whether that city block was adjacent, so like abutting or intersecting a safe passage block, whether it was within a quarter mile, half mile, or just somewhere else contained within the neighborhood in Chicago. We're using Chicago community areas as our proxy for neighborhoods. And so for each of these blocks, we're sort of classifying them into one of these groups. And then we're looking at the different types of crime that occurred at the block level. And so to not put up equations or do anything, what we're trying to do here is look at how the incidence or the total number of crimes at the block level changed within our safe passage blocks as the block shifted from sort of not having safe passage coverage to later having it, while sort of comparing that block on average to some other group of blocks in the city. And so just to give you some sense of what this looks like, this graph is for total crime. And so what we can show, we have figures like this in the paper, is that looking at all safe passage blocks on average in the years leading up to when safe passage was introduced, that's the vertical dashed line, crime was trending in a way that was fairly flat. So this doesn't mean that there were 0 crimes per block, but this means that crime wasn't changing relative to its sort of pre-safe passage level. And then upon the introduction of safe passage, we see this drop off in crime that's sort of immediate, followed by a longer and more steady decline over a number of years as the program gets sort of older, or there have been more years of coverage. So here's what this looks like in regression form. I think this maybe wasn't the best slide to include, but we do a number of things in the paper for those of you who are interested to try to be careful about which sets of blocks we're comparing our safe passage blocks to. And so our main results, I'll just highlight here, are that what we find is that violent crimes decrease by about 20% on average after the introduction of safe passages. Property crimes decrease by about 10%, and non-index crimes, which you can think of as other sort of lower level or miscellaneous offenses, includes things like gambling, embezzlement, fraud, anything that's not one of the main 2 other categories, those decline by 20% as well. And because these different types of crime start at different levels, we've scaled these decreases by the size of the typical size in terms of the number of blocks that have coverage around a school. And so we think another way to think of this is there are about 2 fewer violent crimes per safe passage school per year, 3 fewer property crimes, and 16 fewer non-index crimes per safe passage school per year. So this is pretty substantial in terms of thinking about reduced student exposure. I hope that I can keep going. I have a little cold here. All right, so one of the other, I think, contributions of this paper is that these main findings are not the whole story. So what we do is we try to take advantage of this very detailed data to talk about some of the other unintended consequences. So what we find is that there are very small increases of motor vehicle thefts on nights and weekends. We find some slight evidence of what we call cross-crime substitution. So larceny or theft decreases, but burglary, which occurs indoors, increases. So there's like this small trade-off in the location of crime. We do find some evidence of spatial spillovers and displacement. So some nearby blocks get some monitoring spillover benefit, while there's some small increases in some types of crime in the most remote areas of safe passage neighborhoods. But none of these increases were large enough to offset our main declines. But we still think it's really important to talk about the ways in which this program changed the spatial and sort of timing of crime in Chicago. So we have some other results showing that crimes on school grounds decreased, which we think is really important to talk about given the setting of this program. And so I'll just sum up here. What we find is that the Safe Passage program generally succeeded in reducing crime, but it also had some small unintended consequences. And these unintended consequences were things like this cross-crime substitution, changes of time of day, and spatial displacement. And so we're thinking this is an important contributor to the policy conversation around alternatives to traditional policing, where we're taking unarmed civilians and putting them into a role where we've taken some policing tasks and unbundled them. Thanks so much for including me.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And last but not least is Max and Kirsten.
Let me just start the screen share. See that okay, hopefully.
Yep.
Perfect, great. Well, thanks so much, Jen and the Niskanen Center for organizing this series. So I'm going to tell you about a study currently underway in Chicago of a novel approach to reducing gun violence. Okay, great. So each year, about 10,000 people in the US die from gun homicide, while another approximately 50,000 incur non-fatal, but still often life-altering injuries. This gun violence imposes enormous social costs, estimated to be somewhere in the range of about $100 billion per year. It also creates pretty massive disparities. Young Black men are about 24 times more likely to die from homicide than their white peers. So what are policymakers actually doing about this? Well, at the federal and state levels, efforts to address factors that contribute to gun violence, like gun access and concentrated poverty, move very slowly. And that leads it to local policymakers to reduce the rising tide of shootings. Now, historically, mayors have done this by things like stepping up policing efforts. Today, however, there's a greater recognition of policing's high social costs, which has led many cities to embrace a different approach, which is targeting preventative social services to those most likely to shoot or be shot. But this approach requires overcoming two pretty significant challenges. First, we actually have to find the people who are most likely to be involved in gun violence. Preventative services may not have much impact if they're targeted at the wrong people. And predicting who's at high risk of something as complex as gun violence can be difficult, and we don't know how well we can actually do it. And second, assuming that we found the right people, we need to actually offer them something that can change their behavior and reduce their risk. Much of what we know about how to change behavior involves efforts based on law enforcement rather than social services. What we do know about the effectiveness of social services designed to reduce gun violence specifically is pretty mixed, or the evidence is still forthcoming. And that brings us to the context for the current study. So in 2016, homicide spiked by almost 60% in Chicago. And in the aftermath of that, a group of practitioners and researchers came together and recognized two important things. First, the social services in Chicago, working with those who are considered at high risk, mostly serve youth, when it's actually adults who make up almost 90% of shooting victims in the city. And second, to give policymakers more options for responding to future spikes in violence than just policing, we need credible evidence of a social service alternative that could reduce violence among those at highest risk. And so these discussions led to the development and study of just such an approach. So this new effort, called READY, tries to find the people at highest risk for gun violence and offer them services delivered by local nonprofits. It operates in 5 of the highest violence neighborhoods of Chicago, and it serves a demographic most directly affected by gun violence, which is adult men. Now, within those neighborhoods, READY identifies men at very high risk in 3 complementary ways. First, there are referrals from expert staff of local violence prevention organizations. Second, there's men who are making the difficult transition from jail or prison back to the community. And third, men are identified by machine learning methods applied to detailed police data. So having these three referral pathways casts as wide a net as possible, recognizing that no single method can identify all of those who are at highest risk. So once a person is identified, their first contact with Ready is an outreach worker trying to recruit them. Now, because these men are often disconnected from and distrustful of most social institutions, the response to being offered a new program is often skepticism, that's putting it mildly. So outreach staff often have to work relentlessly in order to engage them. Those interested in Ready are then offered 18 months of supported work, starting with neighborhood revitalization and gradually increasing in pay and responsibility as certain milestones are met. And the job is also very flexible, allowing men who drop off to rejoin once they're able to. To participate in the job, however, they're required to attend paid group-based cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, 3 times a week, and personal development coaching the other 2 days. Now, a large share of shootings in Chicago are thought to be the result of arguments, often over relatively minor things, that spin out of control until people feel that the only appropriate response is to pull out a gun. CBT teaches people how their automatic thoughts and emotions affect their behavior in these kinds of situations. So by teaching people to recognize and restructure those automatic thoughts, CBT can actually change the behaviors that often precede a shooting. Finally, because these men often face many barriers to participating in Ready, things like legal issues, lack of housing, substance use disorder, they're offered referrals to outside services to help address these challenges. So having described what Ready is, let me share both how and what we're actually learning from it. So to date, almost 2,500 men have been identified through the 3 pathways as candidates for Ready. However, this is more than the number of men Ready can actually serve. So in order to allocate the limited number of slots in Ready, each of these 2,500 men is entered into a lottery, with half receiving an offer to participate in Ready and half having access to other programs and services. Allocating slots to Ready in this way is what allows us to credibly learn its impact on violence. For each of these 2,500 men, we can measure whether they've been victims of serious violence or whether they've been arrested and accused of engaging in it using police data. And by comparing these outcomes between the half of the men who are offered Ready and the half of the men who are not, we can learn whether Ready actually reduced people's involvement in violence. Now, a goal of Ready's from the beginning is to produce exactly this kind of credible evidence about whether this kind of an approach can actually work to reduce violence. And so to that end, the study tries to answer 3 major questions. First, can Ready actually find people at very high risk for gun violence? Second, once they're found, will they actually show up to and stick with Ready's programming? And third, will that programming keep them and others safe? Now, because the study is still ongoing, we don't yet know the answer to number 3, which is why it's grayed out here. But I'll share with you what we're learning about who Ready finds and how they respond to being offered programming, starting with the level of need and risk faced by the men who are identified as candidates for Ready. So at the time that they're considered for Ready, these men, who have a mean age of about 25, have a lot of exposure to the justice system. So they have an average of about 17 prior arrests, one of which is for a violent felony. And also importantly, they have a lot of exposure to trauma. So over 3 prior reported victimizations on average, and over 1/3 of these men had previously been shot. But it's not just their need at baseline that matters, right? It's also whether they continue to face a high risk of gun violence in the future. So among the half of men identified for but not offered Ready, this is the control group, we can count how often they become victims of non-fatal shootings or homicides, giving us a sense of just how much risk continues to be faced by the men being offered Ready. So this group experiences 10.4 shootings and homicides per 100 people over a 20-month period. Now, just to give you a sense of how shockingly high that is, here are the rates of shootings and homicides among other residents of Chicago. So the men who are identified for Ready experienced deadly violence at 45 times the rate of the average Chicagoan, at 11 times the rate of people living in the same neighborhoods, and at twice the rate of even other local young men. So given the level of danger and need that these men face, one might expect them to be fairly wary of taking part in a program like Ready. Yet we see that over half of the men with a ready offer actually take part in programming, with even higher take-up rates for the men who are referred by community organizations or returning from jail or prison. Now, just for reference, these rates are comparable to those of in-school programs for high-risk youth in Chicago, despite this being a much harder population to find and to engage. And those men who take part in programming tend to stick with it, with over half still showing up for work 15 months after they started working, and those who show up working almost 3/4 of the weeks available to them. So just to wrap up, that Ready is able to actually find people at such high risk and get them into programming is encouraging for the success of this kind of targeted social service approach to reducing gun violence. However, for this approach to actually be effective, Ready also needs to reduce how often these men are actually involved in serious violence. Now, because Ready programming is over 18 months long, we're still waiting for enough time to pass for all 2,500 men in the study to know whether those offered Ready actually experience less violence. Specifically, we're tracking how often all of these men are the victims of shootings and homicides, as well as how often they're arrested for those and other serious violent felonies. And we look forward to sharing those results with you guys as soon as we have them. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Max. I love a good cliffhanger. So everyone stay tuned for the paper, which I think the results are coming out this fall/winter, if I recall correctly. So we won't have to wait too much longer. Thank you so much to all of our presenters for sharing their work with us today. Thanks to everyone else for being here. And tune in next week, same time and same place, for our last in this 5-part series on how to reduce violent crime. And the registration link is wherever you found the registration link for this one. There it is, surely on the Niskanen Center website. Thanks, everybody, and I'll see you then.